Hi, my name is Daniel Getega. I am a senior studying electrical engineering at Harvard University.
My name is Duha Alfatlawi. I'm a sophomore studying biomedical engineering at Harvard University.
We are members of the Harvard Engineers Without Borders chapter, and this is a presentation about the importance of cultural awareness in humanitarian aid.
So to begin, we want to talk about kind of the inspiration behind why we chose this topic. For me personally, it really came from my father. My father is a role player in the U.S. Army, and his job is basically to both create simulations for soldiers and give them some cultural training regarding the area that they're going to and what are some of the cultural norms where they're going to in order to make sure that they do not unintentionally do something that could be viewed as rude or disrespectful, and make sure that there's trust between the local people and the military in that location.
And for me particularly, I have been the liaison for the Harvard EWB chapter. I have served the role of translator in the community while we are having projects in the community. And serving in this capacity has enabled me to see the importance of understanding the culture of the community you work with so that you make sure you are able to deliver the projects that you're working on properly.
And before we get started on talking about what cultural awareness is, we want to start off by defining culture in the context of our presentation. We know that basically when the topic of culture is brought up, generally people have an idea of what it means, but once you try to constrain it within a set of words, it becomes much more difficult to define.
And so we can define culture in different ways, as Duha has said. And one of the definitions that we got from an Engineers Without Borders conference in San Francisco this year was that culture can be described as a shared set of values amongst a group of people. And if you look on Google, you can find other definitions as well. But we think our definition for culture would be a combination of these sources, and we would prefer to define culture as a shared set of values in a particular nation, people, or social group that is learned and can change through an individual's life.
So now we want to talk about a case study that we think is very relevant to the idea of cultural awareness. And this case study was taken from a report that was done to see whether or not humanitarian aid workers had sufficient knowledge of the minority Yazidi population in Iraq, specifically their culture. And what we want to do is kind of give some background information regarding who the Yazidi people are. Basically, they're a group of northern eastern people living in Iraq, and there's no set country, like there are no set borders. They're generally seen as nomadic people, and the population has been declining for a long time now, beginning with Saddam Hussein's reign in Iraq, who was the dictator at that time. And they're currently being persecuted by ISIS because they are seen as devil worshippers, and that comes from the fact that they will pray to this angel who ISIS sees as being Satan, essentially. So the case study basically wanted to see whether or not humanitarian aid workers had sufficient knowledge of the Yazidi population, and what they did was they surveyed both local people, both like local Yazidi people and the humanitarian aid workers, and compared their answers to see whether or not they did have sufficient knowledge. And what they found was that the workers lacked sufficient knowledge of the Yazidi values, and they were unable to distinguish Yazidi values from values of the majority Muslim population. This case study is particularly important, and we think it's a good example because it demonstrates the complexity of cultural awareness through two major ways. The first way is that it is an example of a minority group within that population. So generally, humanitarian aid workers are already going to a foreign country, and they have to learn the culture of that area. But also, it's important to understand that the majority of the culture, the majority of the people are not necessarily indicative of all the the culture knowledge that needs to be attained, and that also we need to pay attention to minority groups. And then the other reason why this is an important and good example of cultural awareness is that it is an example of the dynamic nature of cultural pressures due to, or cultural changes due to external pressures. And we're going to talk more about what we mean by that specifically in the next slide. So this slide is meant to show how different the minority culture is from the majority. And like I said, the humanitarian aid workers were mistaken in that they attributed the same, like they thought that the Yazidi people had the same same cultural norms as the Muslim population. But what this table here shows is it has major themes on the left, and then it has different beliefs that the Yazidi people hold for each of the themes. And what I went ahead and did was went and highlighted all of the things that are similar between the Muslim population and the Yazidi population. And as you can see, the majority of it is not highlighted, and that is really. And then the other, to further elaborate on the other reason why we chose this example, is that the Yazidi culture is very dynamic. And we see that the external tensions from ISIS are starting to shift Yazidi values when it comes to things like funerals, suicide, virginity, and rape. And what I'm going to do is kind of give more examples regarding that. So in terms of funerals and suicide, generally if someone were to commit suicide, that is seen as a sin, and it is seen as something, an action that does not deserve the proper funeral burial process. And what happened was the researcher that was conducting the study had talked to one of the sheikhs in the area, also like basically the chief of a tribe. And what they learned was that they are starting to look at suicide differently because of the fact that external pressures from ISIS has caused a lot of people to be a lot more depressed and have a more pessimistic outlook on life. Specifically, this man who ended up committing suicide after both his daughter and his wife were murdered at the hands of ISIS. And that man ended up receiving a proper funeral burial, even though that would not have been the case in the past. But because the culture is starting to change, and they're starting to broaden their understanding, that it was something that they went ahead and did. And then the other thing is regarding virginity and rape. Generally, virginity is seen as a very, very important concept for women. And if a girl were to lose her virginity or even get raped, they would not be as accepting of bringing her back into the community and the culture and the family. And what was happening was ISIS was kidnapping a lot of the younger women and using them as sex slaves, essentially. And some of them would escape and come back. And the way they responded to these women was completely different than the way they would have responded in the past. Because again, they realized that the external tensions from ISIS are something that needs to be accommodated culturally as well. So essentially, what did it mean for the Yazidi population when the humanitarian aid workers did not have sufficient knowledge? Essentially, these Yazidis were not distinguished from the majority. Displaced persons have different needs, and they really felt like the humanitarian aid workers were not providing them with sufficient resources and the needs that they needed, and they were receiving inadequate or poor quality goods unintentionally because the humanitarian aid workers did not want to disrespect or give them something that they didn't want. It was just more of they did not understand what the Yazidi people wanted. And then again, they weren't assisted in areas that were previously viewed as being taboo, such as like rape and virginity.
So for Engineers Without Borders, the concept of sustainability is really important. And sustainability means the ability for a structure which is constructed, which is mostly what Engineers Without Borders projects are about. Usually you construct a structure or a system, and you would want that system or structure to be sustainable for a long period of time. Now, sustainability comes in the concept of culture, or culture is seen in sustainability in the sense that as a group, we would like to make sure that the projects that are installed are able to last for a long time. Now, if we are not cognizant of the culture of the communities that we work in, then we may end up building structures or implementing systems that the community is not comfortable with, or that are somewhat disrespectful of their culture, and the community might decide to not own the structure or on the system, and that means that it will not be used, which means that the resources that have been committed to this project would then not be useful, not just for a long period of time, even for the very moment that it's constructed itself. So sustainability and culture seem to have this interconnection that we really would like to be careful about as Engineers Without Borders. So what are some of the cultural challenges that we as a chapter have faced in the projects that we have done so far? So one of the projects that the Harvard EWB chapter works on is a project in Mkutani, Tanzania. And every time we travel to the community, we try to meet the women separately. So the women in our group would meet with the women from the community and chat about some issues that the women face in the community, or even talk about the ideas that these women think will help improve the community or the lives of the people in the community. The reason why we do this is because we know that most of the communities in East Africa do not have women participating in leadership activities, or at least in rural areas, because the communities are still patriarchal, so women don't have much of a say in opinions of leadership, and that undermines the decisions, that undermines, in a sense, that undermines the answers or the responses we get when we're trying to evaluate what the community needs might be. Now, to make this approach or to make this request of a community requires us to be very careful, because we might, in the process of asking these questions, we might imply that the government of the community does not take into account the opinions of the women, and this might come off as disrespectful to the leadership, and we might need to find a way of making sure that we communicate this appropriately so that we are able to work in the community without having to worry about the government not being supportive of the processes that we use to ask questions in the community. The other challenge that as a group we have had to deal with or try to work around is how to manage and work with work contracts or contractors that we work with in the community. And this is really important, that we are able to understand that the way we resolve issues in the states is not the same as the way issues are resolved in the community. Now, for example, one of the projects that we were doing, which involved the construction of a house, there was a delay in the process, and one of our mentors that we were working with, one of the engineers we were working with, was not pleased by the progress of work, and he called out the contractor and was trying to give him deadlines and expectations of what should happen in the event that the project is not completed in time. Now, this tone of work might be common or might be acceptable in the States because it's probably culturally acceptable, but in some of the communities that we work in, this is not something that you could do. Usually you want to approach the contractor in a different way and talk about things and try to understand why this is happening before you actually claim that you do not like the way things are progressing. Now, the other challenge that we had to deal with is understanding that projects, when done, usually they're not done within the deadlines that are set. So you might have a deadline for the 5th of a specific month, and the job is done on the 12th, and that's generally acceptable easily than, if it was a different case here in the United States. it is also very important to put some emphasis on paying attention to details if that is something that you really care about, because these contractors are used to be given an amount, a specific job to do, and they do it the way they used to be doing it. They have a way that they do things, and that is the way that they will stick to, unless you specifically say that this is what I want, and maybe try to explain further why you want it to be done in a different way. Because if they have been doing it in a different way and it's been working before, then it's easier for them to just manage with what they have done. And this is not because they're ignorant of what you are suggesting, but it's because that seems to have worked before and they are sure that it will work for them. Now, suggesting things that you think are much more are better might be a good way to do it, but unless you find a way of communicating this adequately, then this might cause a conflict of some sort or some misunderstanding that you might want to avoid. Now, this is not a challenge that we have faced yet, and it might not be a challenge, you may never have to deal with it, but there are some communities that do not work on the Sabbath day or the seventh day of the week because they go to church on that day, and usually they start on the evening of Friday to the evening of Saturday, so they do not work for a whole 24 hours. Now, for some of the projects that we have done in the communities that we've worked in, we usually work throughout the week, and usually maybe there's a few hours of rest on Sunday because they want to go to church, because they go to church on Sunday. But some of the communities that we are considering to move into in the coming semester might require us to think about whether this is something that we have to deal with, because we will have to find a way of either keeping the Sabbath with them or just try to find a way of not asking them to get involved when they are actually on a Sabbath break.
So, with our case study and the applications that cultural awareness has to our chapter, we kind of want to talk about why it's important to be culturally appropriate, with the first reason being that the community will give more support when they know that you respect their cultural norms. Knowing the culture of the area that you're going to really helps in the trust aspect and really helps the community think and believe that you are coming in with the right intentions and that you have their best in mind. And additionally, it is easier to work with the community when you can understand their lifestyle. It's not good to be sometimes surprised in certain things and have a cultural shock that could prohibit you from really doing your job. So by preparing beforehand and making sure that you understand the culture of the people that you're working with, it makes it so much easier and a smoother transition when you go to a different place. And more importantly, one can leverage this knowledge to ensure projects will be acceptable in the community. And that's probably one of the most important parts, because what's the point of spending time and doing a project when the community doesn't like it and it's not going to be sustainable after you leave? Really making sure that what you're doing is beneficial for the community and they're okay with it is what's going to ensure that they're going to take care of whatever it is that's being built and that they're going to continue using it, and they're going to benefit from it.
So here we have a few tips that might actually help you understand the culture of the community that you're working with. If you are working in a new community, it's really good to be sensitive of the area that you are in. Be sensitive about what people like or what people don't like. Take those into account. It might help to learn a few words, especially if you do not speak the language that they're speaking. Making an effort to learn some words really goes a long way to help them see that you're actually trying to understand them. You can work on building trust and relationships between you and the community. Just try to make sure that they understand that you really trust them and you're willing to build a good relationship with them. And having some offices in the country, if this is a humanitarian aid group, will really help in a big way, because if there are people who are staying in the community, they can help you build on this culture and try to understand the community even more.
Finally, we want to talk about the best way to, what we think is the best way to improve cultural awareness. The first one is to work with people in the community. The people don't have to directly live in the community, but when establishing your team, it's important to make sure that you have people who can represent that community well. And maybe they have family living there, maybe they lived there a long time ago, and they really know how to contribute on behalf of that community. Another one is to set time for cultural preparation and making sure that you are actively doing research of the culture, what they eat, how they spend their day, what's the work life like, things like that. Another one that's really important is to make sure to find a translator. Sometimes we will rely on devices or things that might not be able to pick up cues, but having a translator is really going to help you bridge the gap of misunderstanding between the humanitarian workers and the people. And finally, keep an open mind. Sometimes we can go into a place thinking that we have a specific idea of what we want to do, and then we can find out that that's not what the community wants. And just because we're attached to that idea, it might be a lot harder to let go of it. But just making sure that you keep an open mind and really considering what the community wants as being the best option for them. And these are our sources. And if there are any questions, please let us know. Thank you. Show that a lot of the things that the Yazidi population believe are not shared with the Muslim population. And just because the Muslim population is the majority does not mean that we can immediately assume that the minority population holds those same / similar beliefs.